The night shift nurse arrived at Seattle General at 11:27 p.m., her scrubs the color of old bone, her badge clipped to a pocket that had held pens and broken promises for 3 years. Natalie Hayes moved through the ICU corridors like water finding the lowest point, present, necessary, invisible. She poured coffee into a chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters and stared out the break room window at Philadelphia's rain-soaked streets below. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer overhead. She didn't blink at them anymore. The succulent on the windowsill was dying again. She'd replaced it 7 times. This one had lasted for months, which felt like a personal achievement. She tilted the ceramic pot and watched brown water pooling at the base, evidence of her tending it to death with kindness. Some things couldn't be saved no matter how carefully you held them. She knew this the way certain people know things, bone deep, from experience that lived in scars. Her locker was at the far end of the nurse's station, the one no one else used. Inside, a jacket hung from a bent wire hanger. The lining held a thread of history, a faded unit patch sewn in with stitches that had been done by someone other than the woman who wore it now. The fabric around those stitches had worn soft from being touched, from fingers that sought it the way other people sought prayer beads or rosary chains. 20 years of touching something you can't speak about. She closed the locker without looking at the photograph taped to the inside of the door, a unit of soldiers, faces still bright with the kind of youth that doesn't survive what comes next. Half the faces were circled in black marker. She'd stopped adding new circles in 2006. At 12:34 a.m., the intake coordinator radioed from the ER. Natalie was checking an for infusion rate, the drip clicking like a metronome, counting down hours in milliliters per minute, when the message came through her scrub pocket. Incoming. Deaf patient. Construction accident. Facial trauma. No insurance. The coordinator's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone reading a chart that had already been triaged by cost before medicine. Natalie moved to the intake room and helped the orderlies transfer the patient from the stretcher to a hospital bed, her hands precise and efficient, her movements economical after 1,000 shifts of this. The man was in his 60s, grey at the temples, his face wrapped in gauze that bloomed at the left temple with seepage that suggested ongoing bleeding beneath. His right ear was bandaged heavily. Both eyes tracking movement with the intensity of someone who'd learned to see instead of hear. The construction site had collapsed a beam. He'd been lucky, the ER nurse had written. Still had all his limbs. Still had his life. The luck felt like a complicated thing. Natalie positioned the bed rails and checked the monitoring equipment, the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm, the heart monitor displaying a steady green line of sinus rhythm, the pulse oximeter reading 94%. She spoke slowly and clearly, aware that he was reading her lips, aware of the careful attention in his expression. You're safe now. Seattle General. We're going to take care of you. She placed her hand on the bedrail and held it there, a physical anchor point in a world that had just exploded into chaos and silence. At 1:15 a.m., the unit's attending physician arrived like a weather pattern, inevitable, shaping the air pressure of the entire floor just by his presence. Dr. James Ashford moved through the ICU with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. His shoes were Italian leather, buffed to a shine that seemed to repel the hospital's fluorescent glare. His tie was silk, navy with a subtle pattern that whispered old money and Ivy League summers. He carried his tablet like a general reviewing battlefield logistics, eyes already calculating before he'd read the first line of the patient's chart. No insurance, he asked the intake nurse, already knowing the answer, already performing the motion of asking for the benefit of witnesses. Construction accident. Uninsured laborer. No emergency contact on file yet. Ashford's jaw moved slightly, a micro-expression of disappointment. The kind of movement that takes less than half a second but communicates entire paragraphs. He set his tablet on the bedside table with the precision of placing a chess piece. Deaf, I'm reading here. Unilateral hearing loss in the right ear, complete. Congenital or acquired? Congenital on the right side, the ER nurse answered. Recent trauma damage to the left. Waiting on ENT consult. Ashford nodded, his face settling into the expression of someone performing competence for the chart. He was a man who understood that efficiency metrics required documentation of sound reasoning, that the board appreciated physicians who demonstrated fiscal responsibility. A patient with no insurance was already a calculation problem. Add deafness, communication barriers, complex accommodations, specialized equipment, and suddenly the math got messier. He glanced at the patient once, the kind of glance you give to an invoice you'll need to process later. "Let's stabilize him and reassess in 12 hours, he said. "We'll coordinate with county services for transition of care. I want a clear handoff plan, nothing complicated, nothing long-term." The ER nurse nodded. Natalie, restocking the supply cart at the far end of the unit, kept her hand steady and her expression neutral. She'd heard this before. She knew the architecture of these conversations, the way a human being became a logistics problem, the way compassion got redefined as fiscal irresponsibility. She didn't flinch. She didn't clench her jaw. She just kept arranging supplies with the precision of someone whose composure was a weapon that never left her hands. At 2:22 a.m., during a quiet period when the unit held its breath between crises, Natalie pulled up a chair beside the ranger's bed. His eyes had been tracking the ceiling, moving in that restless pattern that meant pain or anxiety or both. She positioned her face in his line of sight and moved her hand slowly, forming letters and simple signs learned from videos watched during breaks, from YouTube tutorials viewed at 3 a.m. on her phone in her car parked at the Philadelphia train station where she sat and stared at nothing for exactly 30 minutes before driving home. "Pain," she signed slowly, making a fist and pressing it to her chest, the universal gesture even transcending spoken language. His face shifted. Recognition of being understood. His hands moved in response, rough signs, not trained, just the desperate grammar of someone who'd spent 60 years learning how to be heard without sound. She understood enough: pain in the left ear, pain in the face, can't hear anything except pressure and the echo of what silence sounds like. "We have medication," she said, speaking and signing simultaneously, aware that he might read lips, might prefer to receive information in multiple channels. "I'm going to give you something to help." She moved to the medication cabinet and drew up 4 milligrams of morphine in a 10 cubic centimeters syringe, checked it against the computer order, and returned to his bedside. The full line was in his right hand, the peripheral access clear, the vein clean. She swabbed the port with alcohol and watched the fumes rise like breath in cold air. The medication pushed smoothly, and she watched his face relax incrementally as the opioid crossed the blood-brain barrier and recalibrated his pain into something managed, something bearable. "Better," she signed. His hands moved in response, "Yes. Thank you." And then, quieter, slower, "You understand." Not a question. A statement. A recognition that this woman, this small figure in wrinkled scrubs with calloused hands and eyes that didn't flinch at trauma, understood something beyond the usual hospital vocabulary of pity and clinical detachment. She was present in a way that suggested presence had a cost, that showing up was an act that demanded something from her that she was willing to give. Natalie placed her hand on the bed rail once more. "Rest now," she said. "Sleep if you can." By 4:19 a.m., when the unit quieted into the particular exhaustion that precedes dawn, Dr. Ashford had already made 3 phone calls. She didn't know this yet, but the mathematics of the ranger's stay had already been calculated. The county transfer was being arranged. The specialized accommodations for deafness, interpreter services, visual alerts, communication boards, were being categorized as unnecessary expenditures that belonged to a different system, a less expensive system, a system designed precisely for patients whose ledgers didn't balance. What Dr. Ashford didn't know was that the woman arranging his pillow with gentle fingers and monitoring his oxygen saturation with the focus of someone who'd once monitored it in a burning desert had spent the previous 2 decades in an official state of non-existence. That the patch sewn into her jacket had been folded in the uniform pocket of someone who'd vanished the day the wrong people saw something they shouldn't have. That the scars on her forearms weren't all from the rough life of a night shift nurse, some of them were much older, from places that appeared in no official record, in operations that hadn't been classified until last year, in a black site outside Bagram where a 7-year-old boy had been caught in an ambush and a young Army Ranger had pulled him from a burning Humvee and made a choice that cost her everything. The deaf man in the ICU bed didn't know that either. Yet. But in approximately 36 hours, someone was going to speak his name in a context that would crack open the entire sealed history of why Natalie Hayes had disappeared into the night shift at Seattle General in Philadelphia, why she spent her breaks learning sign language from videos nobody asked her to watch, why she touched things so carefully, as if every object in the world might shatter if handled without specific knowledge of its weight and fragility. The rain outside continued hammering the windows like applause for a performance no one was supposed to witness. The overhead page crackled at 11:53 a.m., cutting through the steady rhythm of the ICU like a blade through silk. Natalie was on her break, sitting in the corner of the staff room with her phone angled low, watching a YouTube video on American Sign Language. The instructor's hands moved with deliberate clarity: pain, help, water. Small words. Essential words. The kind of words that mattered when someone couldn't speak them aloud. The intercom buzzed. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her breathing didn't change. But her thumb stopped mid-scroll. Nurse Natalie Hayes to ICU 4. Your charity case is waiting. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like water filling a cup, slow, complete, and impossible to ignore. 3 nurses looked up from their computers. A resident stopped mid-conversation. Someone's coffee cup paused halfway to their mouth. The words hung in the recycled air, carried by speakers mounted in every corner of Seattle General, broadcast to every floor, every department, every person who happened to hear that particular shade of mockery disguised as efficiency. Natalie closed her phone. Set it face down on the laminate table. Stood up with the kind of deliberate control that comes from having practiced standing up under fire, under pressure, under circumstances where flinching meant dying. Her jaw tightened, just fractionally, just enough to be visible if someone was looking, and several people were. She didn't look at them. She walked toward the door with her badge clipped to her scrubs at precisely the same angle as every other day, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady as a metronome. The young resident watching her, 3rd year from Johns Hopkins, still learning that competence sometimes means knowing when to stay quiet, made a small sound, something between a laugh and a cough. Natalie didn't acknowledge it. She simply moved, the way a tactical operator moves through a building, with purpose, with efficiency, with the understanding that hesitation is a luxury. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. The ICU wing of Seattle General had been recently renovated, all pale blue walls and motivational posters that nobody actually read. The Ranger's room was at the far end, window-facing, the kind of corner unit that typically went to patients with better insurance. Dr. Ashford had assigned it anyway, a calculated move, Natalie understood now. Make the gesture, then weaponize the visibility of kindness that wasn't kindness at all. The Ranger was sitting up slightly, his eyes tracking the movement of a plastic cup on the table beside him. He'd lost most of his hearing in a military accident 18 years ago, something involving an IED and a convoy at 0300 hours. The intake file said a construction accident, but Natalie had read between the lines of his chart the way she read everything, with the attention of someone who understood that paperwork was how institutions lied while maintaining plausible deniability. She approached his bedside. Her phone was in her pocket, the YouTube lesson paused on the sign for pain. She raised her hand slowly, forming the ASL sign with the precision of someone performing a clinical procedure. Both fists, knuckles facing inward, rotating down. The word for pain looked like a contradiction, a gesture that contained its own opposite, question and statement fused into a single motion. The Ranger watched her hands. His eyes were grey-blue, the color of winter water. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. Or the particular weight that comes when someone speaks to you in a language you thought you'd lost. She didn't ask him if he had pain. She knew he did. The way he favored his left side, the microscopic winces when the nurses repositioned him, the tension at the corners of his mouth when he thought no one was watching. Pain was information. Pain was data. And Natalie had learned 20 years ago that sometimes the most important information was the kind that couldn't be written in a chart. The rest of the shift passed in the ordinary way that shifts pass in hospitals: mundane and urgent, routine and critical, all compressed into the same 8-hour container. Natalie worked her stations, checked her labs, documented her observations in the EMR system with the precision of someone who understood that every word in a chart could be used for or against you. By 7 p.m., she was back in the staff room, gathering her things into her locker. Dr. Ashford was waiting on the other side of the supply closet door. He was tall, impeccably dressed, the kind of man whose shoes probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. His presence had a particular quality, not threatening in any obvious way, but the way a bank vault is threatening, the way a locked door is threatening. The quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He smiled like a man checking items off a to-do list. Natalie. Perfect timing. She didn't respond. Just continued reaching for her jacket. The supply closet was narrow, lined with rolling carts of linens and boxes of gloves. It smelled like bleach and cardboard and the faint chemical scent of industrial detergent. The fluorescent light overhead hummed with the particular frequency of a bulb dying slowly. "Your performance review is 6 months overdue," Ashford said. His voice was smooth, surgical, the kind of voice that made statements without emphasis because emphasis would be redundant. "I've been documenting some concerning patterns. Extended patient visit times. Unauthorized consultation with outside ASL interpreters. Resources allocated to a patient beyond his insurance authorization parameters." He paused, letting each item settle like stones in still water. "These are protocol deviations." "He's deaf," Natalie said. Her voice was flat, conversational, the voice of someone stating a fact rather than mounting a defense. "Communication is standard of care. Standard of care for patients with insurance that covers the accommodation." Ashford shifted slightly, his shoulder blocking the doorway. Not threatening in any physical sense, just making it clear that leaving would require asking permission. "You've been working night shift for 3 years. Invisible in scrubs. Quiet. Easy to overlook. I've always appreciated that about you." He smiled without warmth. "But lately you've become difficult to ignore." A single tear traced her cheek, not from sadness, not from fear, but from the precise physiological response of someone's body refusing to obey the commands of their mind. Stress hormones, adrenaline, the involuntary mechanisms of the nervous system expressing themselves without permission. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her movement sharp and economical. Never broke eye contact. Her eyes were the color of old steel, and they didn't blink. "You're excellent at enforcing rules you've never had the courage to break for someone's life," she said. The words fell into the space between them like a challenge. Ashford's smile didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that she'd just said something true enough that he felt the impact of it. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer but infinitely more dangerous. "Courage doesn't pay malpractice premiums." He stepped aside. She left the supply closet without responding, without accelerating her pace, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing that the encounter had registered as anything more than a minor administrative interaction. The emotion would come later, in private, where emotion belonged. For now, there was only the steady forward motion of someone who understood that composure was a weapon and silence was its blade. The next morning, Natalie arrived for her evening shift at 6:02 p.m., 7 minutes early, the way she arrived for every shift. The Philadelphia sky outside the parking lot entrance was the color of old concrete. Rain had been threatening all day and finally arrived around 4 p.m., not a gentle rain but the kind that hammered against windows with persistence and ill intent. Her entire team was gathered at the glass entrance doors. Dr. Ashford stood in the parking lot, approximately 40 feet away, wearing a bright yellow high-visibility vest and holding a clipboard. The vest made him look like a crossing guard at an elementary school. The clipboard made him look like he was executing someone's orders. The expression on his face suggested he was doing both. Behind the glass, the nurses watched. Some made effort not to look directly at the scene. Others recorded on their phones, the small screens glowing like candles. A resident she'd worked with for 18 months looked away when Natalie made eye contact. A young PA who'd asked her for advice about starting and nodded, a small gesture of solidarity and apology and cowardice all combined into one brief acknowledgement. Ashford handed her a high-visibility vest, the same kind he was wearing, the garish yellow of highway construction sites and parking lot safety protocols. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to patient transport," he said. "Your medical credentials are under review. Pending the outcome, this is your assignment." The vest was polyester. The vest was bright enough to be visible from a drone. The vest was the visual representation of demotion, of visibility stripped of authority, of being present without being permitted to participate in anything that mattered. Natalie took it from his hands and pulled it on with the same precision she used to start intravenous lines, smooth movements, deliberate and economical, no wasted motion. The ranger was watching from a window on the 4th floor. She could feel it more than see it, that particular weight of observation that registers in the peripheral nervous system. His hands were moving, forming shapes in the glass, and even from this distance and through the building walls and the rain and the accumulated weight of 20 years of sealed records, she understood what the signs meant, the sign for why, repeated 3 times, each iteration slightly different, each one a question with a different emphasis. Natalie didn't look up. She adjusted the vest, clipped the straps, and turned toward the parking lot where ambulances waited and the rain continued its patient assault on concrete and asphalt and the accumulated compromises that human institutions called normal operating procedure. The night shift would begin in 13 minutes. Inside Seattle General, Dr. Ashford was already making phone calls from his office. She could picture it with the clarity of tactical foresight. Call number 1 to the medical board about her unsanctioned scope creep. Call number 2 to the primary nursing supervisor about her concerning attachment patterns. Call number 3 to hospital security about access restrictions. He was very competent at this, she understood. Not because he had any particular talent for cruelty, but because cruelty didn't require talent. It only required institutional permission and the absence of anyone willing to object. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days of rain. That was the metric by which Natalie measured her demotion, not in hours, but in how many times the Seattle General parking lot transformed into something resembling a flooded concrete lake. Day 1, the drizzle had been manageable. A light mist that clung to her reflective vest like static. Day 2, the rain came sideways, driven by wind that felt personal, as if the weather itself had received Ashford's memo about her reassignment. Patient transport. The words had landed like a diagnosis. Code for exile. She stood beneath the covered ambulance bay at 11:27 p.m., her vest soaked through at the shoulders despite the overhang, watching paramedics wheel a stretcher toward the ER entrance. The patient, a construction worker with a fractured femur, was screaming. Natalie guided the stretcher without being asked, her hand steady on the frame, her movements precise. She'd done this exact motion 10,000 times across 3 years. Invisible. Competent. Ignored. The paramedic didn't look at her. Nobody did anymore. Inside, past the glass doors, she could see the staff moving through the ICU corridor for floors up. She knew the layout of Seattle General the way soldiers know the topography of hostile territory, exits, sightlines, resource locations. For floors up was where the ranger was. Where she'd spent the last 6 hours learning sign language from a 2-minute YouTube video before her access badge had been electronically restricted at 6:15 p.m. Ashford had been surgical about it. Not loud. Not theatrical. He'd simply called security, updated their system, and arranged it so that when Natalie had tried to access the ICU stairwell at shift change, the badge reader had flashed red. A guard, someone she'd helped stabilize after a cardiac event 3 months prior, had apologized and explained that floor restrictions were now in effect. She'd nodded. Said nothing. Walked back to the parking lot. The second day had been worse because she'd known what was coming. Dr. Pierce Ashford had spent the morning consolidating power. she'd overheard fragments of conversation at the nurse's station while she was collecting discharge paperwork for a patient being transferred, Ashford reassigning the ranger's care to the junior residents, Brandon Matthews and Claire Reeves, both competent enough for standard protocol but neither of them trained to recognize the subtle decompensation markers in deaf patients. Deaf patients who couldn't tell you their chest felt tight. Who couldn't verbalize that their breathing had changed. Who signed "okay" because they'd learned early in life that most hearing people didn't have the patience to wait for the full answer. Ashford had also implemented a new security protocol. Natalie had read the memo posted at the ambulance bay entrance. Parking lot transport staff have restricted access above the ground floor to prevent traffic disruptions during active medical procedures. All requests for floor access must be routed through charge nursing. Routed through charge nursing meant routed through Janet, the shift supervisor, who answered directly to Ashford. It was bureaucratic precision designed to keep her away without ever explicitly saying so. The rain intensified at 2:03 a.m., which was precisely when Natalie was returning a wheelchair to the bay. She'd been out here since 7:36 p.m. 7 hours of moving equipment, transferring patients, watching the hospital glow above her like an illuminated fortress. The stretcher wheel squeaked as she pushed the empty chair across wet concrete. Her boots, still regulation issue from her army days, the leather worn soft as suede, left dark prints on the pavement that the rain was already erasing. Her phone sat in her scrub pocket, screen dark. No messages. No pages. Nothing requesting her presence on any floor where things mattered. Up until 6 hours ago, she'd been the one people called during complications. Now she was the one people needed permission to acknowledge. The demotion hadn't broken anything inside her. That would have required something inside her to still be whole. But then, 2:14 a.m. The stairwell door burst open and a junior resident she didn't recognize ran past her, shouting into his radio, "Get the crash cart to ICU 4, we're coding." Natalie's head lifted. Her body didn't move. The discipline held. Code blue. ICU 4. 4th floor. She watched the resident disappear into the hospital, then she looked up. The 4th floor windows blazed suddenly with that specific strobing pattern she'd seen 1,000 times. The light of defibrillators cycling. The light of a body refusing to cooperate with life. The ranger. It took her 2.3 seconds to process the decision. Less time than it would take to draw a breath. She started moving toward the employee entrance, her limp vanishing as she walked, something she hadn't let happen in front of anyone since day one, a small mercy of empty parking lots at 2:14 a.m. Her stride lengthened. Her shoulders squared. The careful, deferential posture that had become her uniform in 3 years of deliberate invisibility simply ceased to exist. The stairwell was empty. She took the steps 4 at a time, her boots striking concrete in a rhythm that sounded like a marching cadence. The sound echoed upward, amplified by the concrete chamber, the acoustic signature of someone who'd climbed stairs in full tactical gear across several thousand different operations. Not a nurse climbing stairs. A soldier. 4th floor. The ICU doors. Her badge wouldn't open them, but they'd propped one side open with a chair during the chaos. She moved through. The scene assembled itself in her mind with the clarity of someone trained to read tactical situations in the first 3 seconds of entry, Brandon Matthews fumbling with a 12-lead EKG. Claire Reeves manually bagging oxygen into a patient whose color had gone from bronze to a shade of blue that suggested minimal oxygenation. The crash cart positioned but not yet deployed. And the ranger, his bed had been wheeled into the hallway during the code response, and his hands were moving in slow, deliberate motions. Not panic signs. Medical signs. Specifically, help. Can't breathe. Chest tight. His lips were the color of slate. The distended jugular veins visible even from the doorway. The way his chest moved without sound, that terrible synchronized breathing that meant the lungs were moving air but something downstream had failed to process it. Muffled heart sounds. The kind of cardiac presentation that got missed in deaf patients because they couldn't tell you what was wrong, and residents fresh out of medical school didn't always know to look. Dr. Ashford was at the nurse's station, 30 feet away. Natalie saw him turn. Saw his eyes track to her, saw the calculation happen behind his expression. Restriction noted. Boundary crossed. He moved toward her with his chest expanded, the automatic posture of institutional authority trying to reclaim space. You are not authorized to be on this floor. Security has been notified. His voice had that particular tone of someone who'd never had anyone refuse him. The tone of someone who'd built a career on the assumption that everyone moved when he spoke. Natalie looked at the ranger. At the hand still signing help. At the oxygen saturation number on the monitor, 64% and dropping. At the ETA of the crash cart team, the monitor was still being positioned. Claire's manual bagging wasn't enough. At the defibrillator pads, still in their plastic packaging, unneeded because this wasn't ventricular fibrillation, this was cardiac tamponade, blood filling the pericardial space, pressing the heart into immobility. Not a code that the crash cart would fix. A code that required someone to cut. She stepped past Ashford without acknowledging him. Not roughly. Just directly, the way personnel moves around obstacles. Brandon started to say something. She held up one hand, not a request. A command. The hand dropped automatically. 20 years of rank structure, even dimly perceived, has weight. 14-gauge needle. Betadine swab. I need it now, she said. Claire looked at her. Who are? The needle. 19-centimeter length. Chest tray. The tone. That was what changed everything in the room. Not a question. Not a request phrased as a question like she'd learned to use for 3 years. Authority with a specific acoustic signature, the voice of someone who'd given medical orders when people's lives depended on the correctness of those orders. Claire moved. The ranger's eyes were on her face. She saw the moment recognition tried to surface. Pushed it down. No time for reunion logistics. Cardiac tamponade didn't wait for narrative convenience. She pulled his gown open. His chest exposed. The anatomy still the same as it had been 20 years ago when she'd pulled him from a burning Humvee outside a base that didn't officially exist. Smaller then. Younger. His father had been a contractor, and the ambush had killed 14 Americans and 3 contractors and one 7-year-old boy who shouldn't have been in that vehicle but had been because his father had brought him to work. She'd found him under a seat. Still breathing. She'd carried him out while ordered to leave no witnesses to what happened in that compound. Orders and reality in direct conflict, and she'd chosen the right one. The needle was in Claire's hand. Natalie took it, steadied the ranger's ribcage with one palm, located the second intercostal space, the landmark between his second and third ribs, and pushed the needle perpendicular to his chest wall. The hiss of air escaping. Immediate. Pneumatic. The sound of pressure releasing from a sealed system. His oxygen saturation ticked upward. 65, 68. 71. The monitor's beeping accelerated, not panic, but the sound of a system returning to function. His hand stopped their frantic signing. His breathing deepened. Air flowing where it had been blocked. She steadied the needle with one hand while reaching for the betadine with the other. Ashford was still standing in the doorway, his mouth open, his mind still processing what he was seeing. Get a central line kit. 7.5 catheter. We're going subclavian, she said to no one in particular. Claire moved. Brandon moved. The ranger's eyes were fully aware now. The oxygen returning to his brain had clarified his consciousness. He was looking at her with an expression that contained more questions than his hands could possibly sign while she was simultaneously keeping a life-saving needle in his chest. She didn't explain. She couldn't. Explanation would require admitting who she was, and she'd spent 20 years not being who she was. Instead, she kept her eyes on the monitor. On his oxygen level climbing. 75, 78. 82. The room moved around her now with a kind of deference that had nothing to do with her legal authorization. When you're competent during a crisis, when your hands move with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this exact procedure under conditions that involved actual gunfire, people follow. Brandon had the central line kit open. She gestured. Introduce the wire through the subclavian, no, there, that angle, guide wire first, then the catheter. Each instruction delivered as fact. Not possibility. Not suggestion. Directive. Ashford was still in the doorway. She could feel his presence like a weight. But he wasn't moving to stop her anymore. He was watching something he couldn't control unfold in front of him, and his mind was already calculating consequences. The ranger's oxygen saturation stabilized at 88%. Better than critical. Stable. She released the needle carefully, secured it with gauze, taped it in place. Her hands were steady. They always were. Fear was a luxury, and she'd given it up 20 years ago. Get interventional cardiology on the phone, she said to Claire. Cardiac tamponade. Likely pericardial effusion from the trauma. He needs percutaneous drainage or we're just buying time. Claire was already reaching for the phone. The ranger's hand moved into her line of sight. Just one sign, repeated twice. Phoenix. His call sign for her from a different lifetime. His name for the major who'd pulled him from burning metal and then disappeared from his life entirely, erased from all records, classified out of existence, ordered to never acknowledge that either of them had survived that day. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Instead, she stepped back, her work complete, the moment of medical necessity over. The crisis had shifted from immediately fatal to survivable. The rest belonged to the system now. The rest belonged to people like Ashford, who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. She walked past Dr. Ashford without looking at him. That was against protocol, he said quietly. She turned back. Just one sentence. No preamble. No apology, that would have been a lie. So was leaving him to die. She walked past the code blue without stopping. 2 a.m. in the ICU. Fluorescent lights overhead. The crash cart was already rolling, residents sprinting toward Trauma Bay 4, the one where they'd moved him that afternoon after Ashford's call to radiology. The one where Natalie had been ordered not to go. Patient transport. Parking lot. Those were her assignments now. Keep moving. Load the next ambulance. Don't look up. Don't ask questions. The elevator doors were closing when she heard it. Not a voice. Hands. Palms slapping glass. Fast. Urgent. She froze with one foot inside the elevator car. The glass doors to ICU were 15 feet away. Through them, she could see the defibrillator pads glowing orange. The monitors in a chaos rhythm. And in the doorway, hand signing. Quick, sharp movements. Help. 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 The same word over and over. His hands. Natalie stepped backward out of the elevator. The doors whispered shut behind her. She moved toward the ICU without permission, without clearance, walking past the charge nurses' station where 3 people sat clicking through orders they would never implement for a patient they'd already written off. One of them glanced up. She was already past them, already crossing the threshold into the sterile zone, already moving like someone who'd made decisions like this before in places where the electricity was gunfire and the ticking clock was actual mortality counting down in real time. The resident saw her face and moved. Not because she ordered them. Because something in her eyes had changed. The timid night shift nurse who'd spent 2 days in the parking lot was gone. In her place was something else. Something made of scars and certainty. Get me a scalpel from the crash cart. Not a request. A command. She was already moving his gown away from his chest. The monitors were screaming. His oxygen sat was 58. His heart was racing at a rhythm that meant it was pumping against something, pressure building inside his chest cavity like the air compressing his heart with every beat. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the space between the heart and the pericardium. He had minutes. "What are you doing?" A resident's voice, thin and panicked. Natalie's hands steadied themselves. Her fingers found the space below his sternum. The scalpel was in her palm before anyone handed it to her. The weight was muscle memory. 20 years of memory. Humvee burning. Smoke thick enough to choke on. A 7-year-old contractor's son pinned under equipment and bleeding into his own chest cavity while the world outside those metal walls turned to fire and screaming. The same hands. The same incision. Below the sternum, midline, one swift controlled movement through skin and subcutaneous tissue. The pericardial sac lay exposed. She'd done this before. Her hands knew the geometry of survival better than her brain ever would. Pericardial window. Now. She was already opening the membrane with the scalpel. Dark blood poured out like someone had punctured a balloon. The monitors immediately changed their rhythm. Not steady yet. Not sinus rhythm. But the pressure was releasing. "What is she?" Dr. Ashford's voice. From the doorway. Then louder, "Stop that. Stop. Liability. Licensure. Do you understand scope of practice?" He was screaming about protocol and procedure and the fact that she wasn't even supposed to be in this room, that she was on administrative reassignment, that this was insubordination, that she was going to cost the hospital its accreditation and his job and everything he'd built on the foundation of people like her knowing their place. Natalie drained the remaining fluid from around his heart. The bleeding slowed. The monitors began their steady rhythm. Beep. 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 She could feel Ashford's presence behind her like pressure against her back, but her hands were already steady, already finished, already certain. His oxygen sat was rising. 72, 79. 84, the numbers climbing like a ladder back to normal. She stepped back from the stretcher and wiped her hands on the paper towel dispenser without looking at Ashford. Her voice was level. "Field thoracotomy. He'll need surgical repair, but he's stable for transport. Get him to OR." The residents scattered. The nurses moved. The machines kept their steady rhythm. Dr. Ashford was already pulling out his phone. The first call came before sunrise. To the medical board. His voice was careful, measured, professional. A physician had performed an unsanctioned surgical procedure while on administrative reassignment. While outside her scope. Without authorization. During patient transport duty when she should have been in the parking lot. The board would need a formal report. An investigation. By morning, the incident report was filed. The second call came at 6:41 a.m. To Human Resources. He requested immediate termination for gross insubordination, scope of practice violation, and patient endangerment. The HR director listened. Took notes. Asked if there was documentation. Ashford had documentation. He always had documentation. The third call took 90 seconds. To security. Her building access should be restricted. Effective immediately. No ID scanning. No override codes. She was a terminated employee as of close of business today, and security needed to ensure she couldn't return to areas where patient information was stored. The fourth call was the one that mattered. To his mentor on the hospital's executive committee. A man who'd helped Ashford build his career over the past 12 years. A man who owed him favors. A man who understood that mistakes like this one, unauthorized procedures, protocol violations, a nurse who didn't know her place, had to be destroyed before they contaminated other staff. Ashford asked him to ensure the termination stuck. To block any appeal process. To make sure this was permanent. By 3 a.m., the termination papers were printed. Ashford waited in the break room with them in his hands, watching the clock. When Natalie came in for her final rounds before the morning shift, before security would physically remove her from the building, he was sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Sit down, Major. He said the rank like it was a diagnosis. Like he'd looked her up. Like he understood something now that he hadn't understood before. Natalie didn't sit. She stood in the doorway of the break room, and something in her posture had shifted. The deferential night shift nurse was gone. In her place was someone who'd been forged in circumstances he would never understand. I'm terminating your employment, effective immediately. He slid the papers across the table. They landed near a sad, decrepit succulent someone had abandoned on the window sill. Gross insubordination. Scope violation. Unauthorized procedure on a patient you were explicitly ordered not to contact. She didn't look at the papers. Why? Her voice was different now. Quieter. More dangerous. Why are you so threatened by me? Ashford stood up. He was trying to tower over her, trying to make his height matter. It didn't. She was looking at him like a sniper looks at a target, with the calm that comes from knowing you've already calculated the trajectory. Because people like you make people like me look like what we are. He straightened his tie. Looked away first. Sign the papers. Security is waiting at the east entrance to escort you out. You have 10 minutes. The box they gave her was small. A cardboard carrier that had once held paper waste from the printer. Inside it went, a cracked mug with her name written in Sharpie by someone she'd trained 2 years ago. A dying succulent with leaves like papery skin. A photograph, the one she'd kept in her locker for 2 decades. Her unit. 14 people in uniform, standing in front of a Black Hawk with the desert stretched out behind them like a grave that hadn't closed yet. Half of them dead now. The other half scattered across the country, carrying classified memories they could never speak aloud. The rain started at dawn. She was 3 blocks away, waiting for the 47 bus, the cardboard box balanced on her hip with the same posture she'd used to carry wounded soldiers through smoke. The same straight back. The same careful breathing. The same absence of trembling that wasn't strength, it was the discipline of someone who'd learned that falling apart was a luxury reserved for people who got to go home. A bus pulled up. Then pulled away. She didn't board it. At 7 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. ICU 4. Now. She didn't move. The rain hammered the sidewalk like applause for a performance only the sky understood. At 7:15 a.m., another text, he won't let anyone near him. He's signing something. Please. By 7:38 a.m., the cardboard box was in a trash bin at the corner, except for the photograph. She slipped it into her pocket. The fabric of her coat was soaked through. She'd been standing in the rain for an hour, and the rain was the only thing that felt honest. It wasn't asking her to be anyone. It wasn't measuring her against policy or protocol or the careful calculations of men who'd spent their lives trying to make themselves smaller by making other people smaller. She walked back toward Seattle General with the photograph against her ribs. The rain was colder now, or maybe she was just running out of whatever reserves had kept her functioning for 20 years. The main entrance was ahead. The glass doors that led to the lobby. And somewhere above those doors, in a room she wasn't supposed to enter, a man she'd pulled from a burning convoy 20 years ago was signing a name she'd buried so deep it had started to feel like a ghost story. The termination papers felt like nothing in her hands. Cheap stock, official letterhead, her name typed in a font that didn't care. Dr. Ashford had cornered her in the administrative office, the morning light coming through the windows like something out of a courtroom drama, and he'd handed them to her with the precision of someone completing a surgical checklist. His voice had been calm. Almost gentle. That was the worst part, not the anger, but the absolute absence of it. You're excellent at enforcing rules you've never had the courage to break for someone's life, she'd said to him 2 days ago. Now he answered that statement with his own 4 words, spoken so quietly the administrative assistant pretended not to hear. Because people like you make people like me look like what we are. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't rage. It was the sound of a man watching his constructed self crumble and deciding to burn the whole building down rather than admit it. She'd looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to see that he understood, finally, that she wasn't frightened of him. That understanding had aged him 10 years in a single moment. Then she'd turned and walked out without another word, because that's what people with nothing left to lose do, they stop explaining themselves. The rain started on Walnut Street. Not the gentle kind that warned you it was coming, but the sudden downpour that hit Philadelphia like judgment, soaking through her jacket within 30 seconds. She stood at a bus stop shelter with a cardboard box balanced on her hip like she'd spent the last 20 years waiting for this exact moment. The box contained a cracked mug she'd stolen from a supply closet in 2003, a dying succulent that had somehow survived 3 years of neglect on a hospital windowsill, and a photograph. The photograph showed 12 soldiers in desert camouflage, standing in front of a Humvee somewhere north of Kabul. Their faces were young. 3 of them were already dead, though they didn't know it yet. In the center stood a woman with Lieutenant bars and a call sign stitched into her uniform in letters no one was supposed to see. Phoenix. That's who the rain was washing away. That's who the cardboard box was supposed to contain, not a person, but a classification. A redacted memory. A name the Pentagon had spent 20 years convincing itself was a myth. She'd walked for 2 blocks before the bus came. She'd sat in the back, water dripping from her scrubs onto the synthetic seat, and she'd held that box like it was evidence. Like it was proof that she'd existed. The other passengers had stared at her the way people stare at anyone who looks like they've just survived something. Because she had. She'd survived Dr. Ashford, which meant she'd survived worse. The bus had carried her through the rain like a hearse carrying a body to its own funeral, and nobody on that bus knew they were sitting next to a woman who'd performed a field thoracotomy with a scalpel in a room that was supposed to be her grave. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was returning to Seattle General for hours later to collect the final paycheck, the one bureaucracy insisted on, the one that proved she'd ever worked there at all. She'd pushed through the revolving doors with the box still under her arm, waterlogged now, the cardboard starting to fold. The lobby was empty except for the security guard who'd watched her get fired. He looked away. The commotion came from upstairs. From ICU 4, where she wasn't supposed to be. The sound of people moving fast but not panicked, the controlled urgency of a medical emergency that wasn't actually an emergency. Voices on the intercom. A charge nurse calling out names. And underneath it all, a sound that stopped her breath, someone signing. Hands moving through the air like they were writing words in light. Hands that were furious. She moved toward it without deciding to move. Took the stairs 2 at a time, the cardboard box forgotten on a stairwell landing. The ICU doors were open. Through them, she could see him. The Ranger. Sitting up in bed, which should have been impossible given the drainage tubes and cardiac monitoring, but there he was, alive in a way that only people who'd survived the unsurvivable could be alive. His hands were moving, signing something in rapid, desperate American Sign Language to the nurses standing around him. They looked helpless. They looked like they were watching someone speak a language that nobody in the room understood. When he saw her, his hands went still. She stood in the doorway, soaked through, the taste of rain still on her lips. He stared at her like she'd been summoned from water itself. His lips moved. Then his hands moved. A single word signed with such precision that the entire room understood it anyway, even without translation. Phoenix. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of a secret being named aloud after 20 years of burial. The charge nurse looked between them, some instinct telling her that whatever was happening in this moment was bigger than ICU protocol. A younger nurse, a new one, maybe 6 months in, pulled the Ranger's intake file with trembling hands. His emergency contact, she read aloud, her voice thin as paper. Captain Torres. And it says here in the notes, the patient has been asking our intake staff for 15 years if we've had anyone named Major Hayes work in our hospital. He says she was a combat medic. Says she pulled him out of a burning Humvee outside Bagram in 2004. Natalie's jaw moved once. That was all. That was the only acknowledgement the room got. The ranger was watching her face like he was trying to memorize it again, in case she disappeared. Because she had disappeared. She died on a landing zone outside Kandahar in 2004 and spent the last 20 years pretending to be a living person. This ranger had been the last thing she'd saved before the Pentagon had sealed her rank and buried her service record under classifications that wouldn't be declassified for 2 decades. The hospital administrator arrived within 15 minutes. Tall woman, grey suit, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change in the room. She was also a Navy SEAL team leader, retired, which nobody except maybe the CEO actually knew. She'd heard about the incident through veteran networks the way birds hear about weather systems before they hit, through some invisible communication system that civilians would never understand. She stood in the ICU doorway with 3 other people in civilian clothes, and she announced to the gathered staff with the precision of someone reading from a classified document, Major Natalie Hayes holds 2 silver stars for the 2003 Sanjin Valley operation. 1 bronze star with valor for emergency medical intervention under fire. 2 purple hearts for combat wounds received in the line of duty. Her service record was sealed for her protection following testimony she provided to a congressional committee regarding interrogation protocols that violated the Geneva Convention. The words fell like shrapnel. They bounced. The staff nurses looked at Natalie like she'd been abruptly replaced with someone else, someone more real, someone who'd been underneath the scrubs the whole time. The ranger's hands moved again, signing something that looked like prayer, and Natalie let him see her face move through all of it without trying to hide. The mask was coming off whether she wanted it to or not. What happened next ended careers. Dr. Ashford, realizing that his calculated strategic precision had somehow failed to account for the existence of honor, did what competent men always do when they sense defeat: he pivoted to attack. He contacted Channel 7 News and demanded an emergency interview slot. The evening broadcast. Live television. He was going to fix this narrative before it fixed him. The studio was cool and artificially bright, the kind of lighting that made everyone look either guilty or angelic depending on the makeup artist's bias. Dr. Ashford sat across from the anchor with his talking points arranged like a surgical tray: credential fraud, patient manipulation, unauthorized medical procedure, patient safety concerns. His voice was smooth. Confident. He'd played this game his entire career, controlled the narrative, weaponized policy, made the audience believe what he needed them to believe. This woman falsified her credentials, he began, developed an inappropriate attachment to a patient, and performed an unauthorized surgical procedure that could have resulted in. The anchor's earpiece crackled. Her eyes widened slightly. She held up her hand, and Dr. Ashford's voice died in his throat like she'd performed a verbal thoracotomy. "We have a Pentagon liaison calling in. Colonel Maria Santos. Colonel, you're on the air with millions watching." The voice that came through the speaker was cold precision. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 3 decades enforcing classification protocols, and it delivered each sentence like it was being filed as evidence. Dr. Ashford has just publicly named a decorated officer who was under federal witness protection. He has compromised 7 classified military operations by forcing Major Hayes to identify herself before a nationwide audience. The operations he referenced are subject to the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, which makes his actions a federal crime. Ashford's face was draining color in real time. The makeup artist had gotten the lighting exactly wrong. He looked guilty. He looked terrified. He looked like someone watching his carefully constructed life collapse on live television while millions of people watched. He has named a military witness who testified against a dismantled interrogation unit, Santos continued. That testimony resulted in 3 federal indictments and 2 convictions. Major Hayes was placed under classification to protect her from retaliation. Dr. Ashford's actions have compromised her safety and violated federal security protocols. The studio went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum, that electrical buzz that only becomes noticeable when nobody's breathing properly. Congressional oversight has been notified, Santos said. Medical board, federal investigators, and the FBI will be contacting you regarding your role in compromising national security assets. That's all. The line went dead. The anchor looked at Ashford like he'd just confessed to murder. By the time he left the studio, his phone was already screaming with notifications: medical board, hospital CEO, his mentor who'd suddenly stopped returning calls, defense attorneys he'd never wanted to need. The investigation would take 6 months. The trial would take longer. The insurance policy job at the mall would come later, after his assets had been liquidated and his reputation had achieved a perfect negative charge. 6 months later, Natalie stood in full dress blues on the marble floor of Seattle General's new veteran trauma wing. The silver stars were back on her chest. The bronze star. The purple hearts. The rank of major was embroidered in thread the color of blood and commitment. Captain Torres stood beside her, pinning her restored insignia with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred ceremonies. The ranger stood on her other side in his own Army Ranger uniform, no longer deaf after the specialized neurosurgery that had repaired the nerve damage the cardiac tamponade had caused. He was looking at the glass case on the wall. The one that held a faded unit patch, edges worn soft from being carried in a wallet for 20 years. The patch she'd sewn inside her jacket lining before she died. Before she was buried. Before she became invisible. When Natalie finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was lower. It was command. It was the voice she'd been hiding under scrubs and deference for 2 decades. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she said. The ranger signed it back to her, and everyone in the room understood. Not just the words. The meaning. The refusal. The survival. The woman who had refused to give up when everyone else had already written the epitaph. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.